Hey guys, welcome back. This is going to be my final prediction video on what I think is going to happen to Super Tuesday, predicting who I think is going to get first, second, and third place respectively in each of these contests. I've been really excited about putting this video together. It's the day throughout this election season where we're going to have the most contests, the most pledged delegates up for grabs, and it'll give us an idea of exactly where this primary is headed following all of these contests. So it's a really exciting time and really fascinating, interesting to see how all of this ends up playing out. And things have certainly changed over the past few days. You have Joe Biden, who's kind of propelled himself back into a co-frontrunner status with Bernie Sanders, given how well he did in South Carolina, even doing significantly better than what his relatively strong performance was expected out of that state, really blowing past the rest of the field and defeating Sanders by around 30 percentage points. So a really positive sign there from Biden. And then the centrist moderate lane has been coalescing behind Joe Biden to be their leader in this race. You have Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar both bowing out of the race and going on to endorse the former vice president, as well as a number of other Democratic figures coming out and endorsing Biden. We'll see what kind of effect that has on Super Tuesday, but just his relative strong performance in South Carolina are bringing a lot of that Biden voter back. A number of them had kind of faded away from him after his electability argument took a beating after Iowa and New Hampshire, but he's been able to gain back some of that confidence, taking a step forward in the most relevant recent polls that we've seen. Now, those haven't even been showing the bump that Biden might be getting from the Buttigieg and Klobuchar endorsements. So he actually could be into a situation now where he's actually surpassed Sanders nationally. We won't know until we see what actually happens on Super Tuesday and then the polls that start to come out after that. But in terms of a lot of these predictions that I'm making, not a whole lot of recent relevant data to go off of. So I'm kind of going in blind and just going to give it my reasonable best effort. So just to take a look at where the map is and what I think is going to play out through the rest of primary season. So it's going to be somewhat similar to what we had in 2016 with Joe Biden taking the Hillary Clinton lane of voters, where Bernie, of course, playing the role of himself in 2020. He's likely to have success continuing to where he had back in 2016. But I also think there's areas where Sanders can expand on that electorate and have a bit more success in some of these different states. Now, Joe Biden, he's likely to have his most strength down here in the Southeast. We saw it clearly in South Carolina, but a number of these other states that were very strong for Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden is likely to do well in. Bernie, he's going to have his most strength more than likely up here in the Northeast, as well as out West. But what Bernie is going to likely do this time around in 2020 that he didn't do so well in 2016 is down here in the Southwest with that Hispanic vote. If he can come in and do a lot better than what he showed in 2016, he lost a number of these states to Hillary Clinton. If he's able to pick that up, it possibly puts him into a scenario where he can get more pledged delegates than Joe Biden by the end of this campaign. Now, the areas where I expect Biden and Bernie to be relatively competitive with one another would be over here in the East and then moving into the Midwest. That's going to be kind of the battleground region of this Democratic primary. So that's how I'm thinking things are going to play out going into Super Tuesday, and a lot of my predictions are based on these assumptions. Also, I kind of did a rough draft on what I thought I was going to do for my predictions. This was back before the South Carolina primary, kind of getting my thoughts in order, and I've revised things over the past couple of days, significantly boosting up Biden's chances in a lot of these different races. So now jumping into it, going to start in alphabetical order here. The first state is Alabama, and kind of like South Carolina, this is expected to be an extremely strong state for the former vice president. The African-American vote likely to show up for Biden in the state of Alabama down there in Southeast, like he showed us in, of course, that South Carolina victory. So Joe Biden putting him in first. I think Bernie Sanders is able to get at least to the 15 percentage point threshold to get something in the way of pledged delegates. And then I think Michael Bloomberg, given the ad spend that he's had in the state, is going to be able to get a third place finish. And this is kind of what I'm going to have in a lot of these states where it's either going to be Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders first and second, and then the third place kind of comes down to between Michael Bloomberg or Elizabeth Warren. Moving over to Arkansas, this is one of the states that I had a tougher time with, and probably about a third of these Super Tuesday states, I feel really strongly about Bernie going on and winning, and probably around 5 or so of them really strongly for Joe Biden. And then there's around 5 contests that I think you could make a reasonable argument that it could go any way between Biden or Sanders. So moving down to Arkansas, this is one of those states where I think could possibly be competitive. Now, if we look back to 2016, this is where Hillary Clinton was able to get past Bernie Sanders. Of course, the Clintons have ties to the state of Arkansas. I think it's relatively competitive, but I also feel down there in the Southeast that Joe Biden is able to pick that one up. Again, with Bernie Sanders getting second place and Michael Bloomberg, given his ad buys in the state, able to grab third place finish. Gonna fix that one here, make it capitalized. All right, so then moving on to American Samoa. This one is extremely hard to predict. They have a caucus out there, and only probably about 200 to 300 people are going to be voting in this result. No polling, obviously, has been done in American Samoa. I'm not actually even sure who the constituents are that vote out there, if it's more of the local population or if it's people who serve in the American military. I'm not exactly sure the whole process that goes on out there in American Samoa. Clinton was able to win by a decent margin over Sanders back in 2016, but Sanders has a lot more name recognition this time around going in to that particular result. I think it's actually really competitive between Sanders and Biden, but I actually do think Bernie is going to be able to pick up American Samoa this time around with Joe Biden getting second place, and we might not even get a third place finisher if no one's able to get viability at these caucus sites. But if I guess if I had to pick one, I'm going to go ahead and side with Michael Bloomberg in that instance. Now moving out to California, the key important state, 415 pledged delegates up for grabs. Now that we're seeing the race consolidate where Klobuchar and Buttigieg supporters aren't going to be voting as much for their candidate, obviously, on Election Day, we could actually get a situation statewide where you could end up getting Bernie, Biden, Bloomberg, as well as Elizabeth Warren all over that 15 percentage point threshold. We'll have to see if that is the case or not, but the polling has been very bullish on Bernie Sanders out west in California, particularly with his strength among the Hispanic vote, which is very key to having success in California. I actually wasn't all that high on Joe Biden in California for the past few weeks, but we have seen some more recent California data that has been a bit more bullish for the former vice president, likely getting a big boost out of that South Carolina result. And then third place, I think you could make a reasonable argument for Bloomberg or Warren. Bloomberg, given the ad buys that he's had across the state, but then Warren, just the fact that I think she can pick up some of that progressive vote from the state. It's probably pretty close between them, but I actually think Elizabeth Warren might be able to pull out a third place out there in the state of California. Moving over to Colorado, 67 pledged delegates up for grabs. In these western states, I think, is where Bernie Sanders is going to continue to have success. The polling has been pretty sound for Bernie Sanders in Colorado, although a lot of these Super Tuesday states, we actually haven't gotten much in the way of polling data, and it wouldn't even really be that relevant up to this point, considering how much the race has changed over the past couple days. But then in second place, I was actually pondering Elizabeth Warren here for a bit, but now that Joe Biden has seen a resurgence here, I think he ends up getting second, with Elizabeth Warren coming in third place. Moving out into the Northeast, an area that Sanders is expected to have success. Now, he actually didn't perform quite as well in New Hampshire as what I was expecting. Pete Buttigieg, surprising a lot of people, very strong in that New Hampshire result. But now that Pete Buttigieg isn't going to be a factor up there in the Northeast, that probably is a net benefit to Sanders, even with Buttigieg going on and endorsing Joe Biden. I think that Bernie is able to go on and claim the state of Maine. And this is another case where I think Joe Biden moves his way into second place given his recent resurgence. And then Elizabeth Warren, also a senator there from up in the Northeast, I think she's maybe able to get past Michael Bloomberg there in the state of Maine. Now moving down to Massachusetts, a fascinating race to behold in this one. You have Elizabeth Warren, the sitting senator from the state of Massachusetts, but then you have Bernie Sanders from the neighboring state of Vermont, very well known in the area. He went about 50-50 with Hillary Clinton back in 2016 in the state. We've seen some fairly positive signs that Bernie Sanders might be able to pick up this contest, and I think it's going to be pretty close at the top between Sanders and Warren, but I think Sanders is able to eke out a win. Also, just people that might be thinking more strategically in terms of their vote might be casting that progressive vote more so for Sanders in a lot of these Super Tuesday contests as opposed to Warren. And then third place, I think it's probably relatively competitive, maybe possibly between Bloomberg and Biden in this particular race, but I actually do think that Biden is going to be able to eke out Michael Bloomberg for that third place finish. Now, Minnesota, I was thinking maybe Klobuchar for quite a while, but now that she's out of the race, she's probably not in serious contention to go on and finish in the top 3. Now, if we look back to 2016, Sanders absolutely cleaned up in Minnesota, but it was a caucus back then, so it's a primary this time around. Probably going to make things slightly more competitive, but I'm feeling much better about Bernie Sanders going on and picking up Minnesota now that Klobuchar is out of the race. And with Klobuchar putting her momentum, whatever that momentum might be in terms of this endorsement, and then also with it being her home state, I think that probably boosts Joe Biden up into getting that second place finish. And then I also feel like Elizabeth Warren is going to pull in a third place result up there. There is certainly a progressive vote to be had in a Minnesota Democratic primary, and I feel like that probably gives a little bit more of a boost to Elizabeth Warren in contrast to Michael Bloomberg. Now moving out to North Carolina, and we have a number of states now that I'm going to go through where I had a tough time picking between one candidate or the other on who I thought was going to go on and win the state. We have seen a number of North Carolina polls where Bernie's been in first, also a few where Biden has been in first place. I think the surge post South Carolina is perhaps enough of a difference maker to put Joe Biden into first place in the Tar Heel state. Also, there's a strong contingent of African American voters. That should be pretty good there for Biden. Hillary Clinton was able to win North Carolina back in 2016. Relatively competitive race, but able to eke it out past Sanders. I think Sanders finishes in a relatively respective second place, maybe fairly competitive there with Biden within single digits. And then in third place, going to be going with Michael Bloomberg. I think his ad buys across the state are enough to get him past Elizabeth Warren for that third place finish. Oklahoma really struggled with this one because a lot of the data has been pointing towards Joe Biden, but I'm actually going to go a bit counter to what the consensus here is out in Oklahoma. Bernie Sanders did very well in Oklahoma in 2016 against Hillary Clinton. I think some of that support is going to carry over. Now, not as much of a diverse state, not as much Hispanic vote in Oklahoma, which is one state north of Texas, where there is quite a bit more of that Hispanic vote to be had, which can be beneficial to Sanders. But nonetheless, I still feel like Sanders is going to carry over that 2016 success he had from Oklahoma and be a competitive first and second place finish at the top, with Joe Biden getting second place and then Michael Bloomberg getting in that third place slot. And really, with this battle here between Warren and Bloomberg, some of these more liberal and progressive states, I'm kind of giving the lean over to Warren, and then some of these more conservative states giving a bit more of the lean to Bloomberg. That's kind of the methodology that I've been kind of putting forth there in that third place slot. Moving on to the state of Tennessee, one of these southeastern states, African-American contingent that will likely be there for Biden and some of these conservative white voters. That boosted Biden in an area like South Carolina and probably Alabama, Arkansas. You can also make a similar case for Biden in the state of Tennessee. I think he goes on and picks that one up, with Bernie Sanders finishing in second place and then Michael Bloomberg finishing in third place. Now, another very important state on Super Tuesday is Texas. 228 pledged delegates up for grabs. I think the Hispanic vote is going to make the difference here for Sanders to win the state. And it's also important to note that there's been a lot of early voting in the state of Texas that wasn't going to be affected by the South Carolina result or some of these recent endorsements, likely more beneficial to Bernie Sanders. I think he's able to go on and pick up a fairly competitive victory there in the state of Texas, with Joe Biden finishing in second, and then Michael Bloomberg, given his ad buys across the state, I think he's able to get past Elizabeth Warren in a third place finish. Now moving back out further west, Utah was very positive to Sanders back in 2016. We've seen some positive polling from Sanders out of the state, although there hasn't really been all that much in the way of polling data to go off of. I think Sanders is able to carry the state again this time around, with Joe Biden moving up into second given his recent surge. And then in third place, I feel like Elizabeth Warren is going to eke it out past Michael Bloomberg, but I feel like it could be relatively competitive there in that third place slot. Vermont, probably not a huge surprise. I have Bernie Sanders going on and winning the state. I think there's an argument to be made for second place either between Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden. It is the neighboring state to Massachusetts. Maybe there is something of an Elizabeth Warren coalition, but I feel like Joe Biden ends up getting second place, with Elizabeth Warren going on and claiming a third place finish. And then the final state here, another one that I really struggled with. I think it's actually going to be very competitive between Biden and Sanders. Virginia, though, there's a lot of upper class white voters, upper middle class even white voters that might be a bit more moderate and kind of going into that Joe Biden lane. There's also a bit of an establishment Democratic vote in the state of Virginia as well as the African American vote. So I think that contingent all combined is going to be enough to get Joe Biden into that first place slot. Second place going to Bernie Sanders, and then third place over to Michael Bloomberg, again, given his ad buys in the state. So that's it. All 15 contests going through, and who I think is going to get first, second, and third place, respectively. Again, not a whole lot of data to work off of, especially with all of the recent news that we've had that could possibly change things quite significantly. But if this is what actually happens, we can see here that I have Joe Biden out of these 10 contests winning 5 of them, with Bernie winning 10. That would be an extremely positive sign for Sanders and maybe propelling him back into a clear front runner status. I have Biden going on and taking areas like Alabama, Arkansas, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia, kind of that east, southeast section of the United States, where with Bernie, I have him claiming the Northeast results, the results out west, as well as the Midwest result there with Minnesota. So you have Bernie Sanders, kind of that American Samoa one. It's really a coin flip. It could probably go any way. You could make a reasonable argument. But then I have Sanders coming through in California, Colorado, Maine, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Oklahoma, not feeling quite as strong about that one. Texas could be a tough one. And then feeling a bit more confident to wrap things up with that Utah, Vermont going to Bernie Sanders. So if you're interested in seeing how I do with these predictions, come back after the fact. I'm going to recap all of these predictions, see where I went right and where I went wrong. Probably going to have a lot of red on the board. Hopefully I get something in the way of respectability, but again, kind of going in with not as much data as I'd like to have when making and committing to a final prediction. So I appreciate you guys stopping by. Consider subscribing for more, and I hope to see you back here for my next video.